Tomorrow, on September the 11th, 2018, already 17 years will come to pass since the so-called 9/11 terrorist attacks that were perpetrated by some groups of Muslim terrorists linked to Al-Qaeda and or other Muslim terrorist organizations. They killed almost 4,000 people, mostly in Washington, D.C. and New York, especially New York City. I'm sorry. They killed almost 3,000 people, according to Wikipedia. And over 6,000 people were injured. The classic images, of course, of those hijacked airplanes being deliberately flown into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in the center of New York City, and then the smoldering and collapsing towers in the so-called Ground Zero are deeply ingrained in the minds of those people who are old enough to remember them. As an aside, none of my current students, I currently have 12 students officially, are old enough to remember them. And I'm not even sure if all of them were alive. Probably the youngest of them was born about 1 week earlier. There have been a number of conspiracy theories which allege that the then US President George W. Bush and or his key administration officials in charge of national security, like the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and the if there is a Secretary of Interior in the United States, I'm not sure, that they must have known that such attacks were coming and could come at a very short notice or with no notice at all. But anyway, they did not take on purpose sufficient measures to control the situation, to contain it, and therefore they basically were responsible, at least partly, for the deaths of those nearly 3,000 people and the injuries of over 6,000 people. Others believe that, others of a less conspiratorial mind believe that the US government did know that there were terrorist groups who could attack the United States, but apparently either believed that the security measures were sufficient to give the government enough of a warning to alert it if such attacks were being seriously and urgently planned, or then they were working on improving the security devices, but the work was still unfinished when the attacks took place. They took place slightly under 8 months after George W. Bush had become the 43rd US president on January the 20th, 2001. Be that as it may, those attacks marked the start of the so-called War on Terror, and some people, including myself, would say that therefore the Third World War has already lasted, albeit on a less than full scale, for 17 years. Of course, it doesn't have any fixed fronts, aside from some fronts in Syria and Iraq, where a group of radical Muslims is still trying to establish an Islamic State. They used to be known as ISIS, now they are known as ISIL, if I remember correctly, and have recruited people worldwide, even from the northern European countries like Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland. So 4 passenger airlines that were operated by 2 major US passenger air carriers, United Airlines and American Airlines, all of which departed from airports in the northeastern part of the United States, bound for California, were hijacked by 19 Al-Qaeda terrorists. And this terrorist organization was led by the Saudi-born radical Muslim terrorist, Mr. Osama bin Laden, until his death, perpetrated by special units of the US Air Force, if I remember correctly, in his compound in Pakistan in May 2011. So the two ill-fated airplanes, American Airlines Flight 11 and United Airlines Flight 175, were crashed deliberately by two different Muslim terrorists into the North and South Twin Towers in Lower Manhattan. And within an hour and 42 minutes, both towers collapsed. They were made of 110 floors or stories. A third airplane, American Airlines Flight 77, was crashed into the headquarters of the United States Defense Department, known as the Pentagon, in Arlington County, Virginia, and the building's west side partly collapsed. Many of the brave passengers of United Airlines Flight 93, while they had no hope of escaping from a violent death, at least tried to take control of the aircraft from the hijackers, causing one of them to deliberately crash it into a field in Stony Creek Township near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. That airplane could easily have been crashed into another building of the United States federal government or into another major commercial building that could have resulted in hundreds or even thousands of more deaths. Firefighters and law enforcement officers were among the major groups of the killed. A total of 415 of them were killed, of whom 343 were firefighters, and the remaining 72 were law enforcement officers, mainly police officers. The United States, as I said, then responded by launching the war on terror and then invaded Afghanistan to depose the Taliban, another radical Muslim terrorist group, which had not complied with the US demands to extradite bin Laden and expel al-Qaeda from Afghanistan. Many countries, starting from the United States, strengthened their anti-terrorism legislation and expanded the powers of law enforcement and intelligence agencies to prevent terrorist attacks. Although Mr. bin Laden initially denied any involvement, he claimed responsibility for the attacks in 2004. Al-Qaeda and bin Laden cited as reasons or motives for the attacks the fact that the United States supported Israel, that there were US troops in Saudi Arabia, Mr. bin Laden's home or native land, and that the United States continued to impose sanctions against Iraq a decade after the first Persian Gulf War. The destruction of the World Trade Center and nearby infrastructure seriously harmed the economy of Lower Manhattan and had a significant effect on global markets, which resulted in the closing of Wall Street until September the 17th, and the civilian airspace in the United States and its northern neighbor Canada until September the 13th. On November the 18th, 2006, so over 5 years after the attacks, construction of One World Trade Center began at the World Trade Center site. It was officially opened 8 years later on November the 3rd, 2014. Numerous memorials have been constructed, including the National September the 11th Memorial Museum in New York City, the Pentagon Memorial in Arlington County, Virginia, and the Flight 93 National Memorial in a field in Stony Creek Township near Shanksville, Pennsylvania.